So I'm Connor Ryan, and I'm the Rhododendron Collections Manager at Holden Forests and Gardens, which means that I kind of have a hand in everything horticultural regarding rhododendrons at Holden. And I curate our rhododendron collection and run our breeding program, which has been going for several decades now. And Holden Forests and Gardens is the name of the whole deal. It's quite an enterprise. It used to be that Holden Arboretum was its own thing. The Cleveland Botanical Garden was its own thing. But in 2014, they merged and became Holden Forests and Gardens. And the Arboretum actually acquired what is now the David G. Leach Research Station in the 80s. And so it's really this big botanical group of gardens in Northeast Ohio. And every time I look, the number seems different, but I'm gonna go with we're the 12th largest public garden in the United States by area. And that a lot of that has to do with more than 3,000 acres of natural areas, in addition to about 500 acres of cultivated space. And within that, we have a disproportionate amount of space dedicated to rhododendrons. So at the Arboretum, we have about 30 acres of rhododendron gardens. An old garden started in the 60s, and then a newer garden is put in 2013. That's about 30 acres, and then the David G. Leach Research Station, which is another 30 acres elsewhere. And so just to give you a little bit of geographic perspective, so here we are in Cleveland. This is you-ish. So the Cleveland Botanical Garden is on the east side of Cleveland in an area called University Circle. And then the Holden Arboretum is in rural Lake County, the next county over. And then if you go to the other side of Lake County, about a mile south of Lake Erie, you hit the Leach Research Station. And so we have these three campuses, all have a little bit of rhododendrons, and we have quite a story to tell with our collection. And so the Holden Rhododendron Collection started in 1940. There's a pretty prolific and pioneering rhododendron breeder named Charles Dexter from Sandwich, Massachusetts. And he, which is incredibly prolific, would breed rhododendrons and send them all over the United States for evaluation. And that's how our collection started. He sent 250 rhododendrons to the Arboretum, and we call that the start of our collection. The best one was actually named after our first director, Warren Corning. So this his wife, Maud. It's really a spectacular plant, almost tree-like, very pink, fragrant flowers, just a sight to behold. And so since 1940, our collection has really only grown. We're up to almost 1,900 plants within the collection, 750-ish unique types of plants, and about 50 species. And so it's, the Eastern United States is actually kind of a challenging place to grow rhododendrons compared to the Western United States, but we have a pretty substantial collection for Eastern gardens and really in general. And our collection has really been shaped by the local history of the area, because rhododendrons are not really. I mean, we have very few. There are very few rhododendrons that are cold hardy in this area in Northeast Ohio, and so a lot of local nurserymen like Tony Shammarello and Peter Girard and Paul Bosley kind of took it upon themselves to develop and select rhododendrons that can take a zone 5 or a zone 4 winter. And so that's what a lot of our collection has become. I think before I get too far into the talk, we should probably talk about the different types of rhododendrons. From a gardener's perspective, there's about four. And so those can be split into the so-called true rhododendrons and then the azaleas. The true rhododendrons can be split into the lepidote or small leaf rhododendrons and the e-lepidote or large leaf. Lepidote means scaled. So if you look at the leaves of a lepidote rhododendrons, there will be tiny scales. I can see them. I still have good enough eyes to see them, but you might need a hand lens. But if you put a leaf up to the hand lens, you should be able to see scales, and sometimes on the stems too. And that's the easiest way to tell. And if you've heard of PJM, that's probably the most famous rhododendron ever. And that's a classic example of a lepidote or small leaf rhododendron. Then you have your, I guess what people probably first think of when they think of a rhododendron, your elepidote or large leaf rhododendrons. And with this big truss, which is the kind of the informal word for the cluster of flowers on a rhododendron. And it's evergreen like the lepidote rhododendrons. And some of the most common ones are ones like English Roseum and Nova Zembla. And then of course you have your azaleas, and those can be split into two different types, evergreen azaleas and deciduous azaleas. And so this is pretty straightforward. Evergreen azaleas are evergreen. Of course, up here, we sometimes call them persistent leaved because they're not exactly evergreen when it gets really cold. And then the deciduous azaleas, which will drop their leaves in the fall. And there's so many of these, I think you're probably aware as a gardening group. There is a little nuance to it. And so if you look at the evolutionary history of rhododendron, you have these 4 horticultural groups, but they don't really suss out when you look at how rhododendron evolved. And so you have this is an evolutionary tree, we call it a phylogeny, and each point here would indicate a common ancestor for these different groups. And so, for example, this group is the large leaf elepidote rhododendrons. And this group is the small leaf lepidote rhododendron. And if you kind of see, eventually they share a common ancestor, but there's some other stuff in between. And so it turns out that the so-called true rhododendrons aren't exactly all that related to each other. I mean, they're all rhododendrons. But it turns out that the elepidote large leaf rhododendrons are most closely related to deciduous azaleas. So closely related that you can actually get hybrids between deciduous azaleas and elepidote rhododendrons they call azaleodendrons. And then you have your evergreen azaleas, which show up over here, and which is kind of saying that maybe they're a bit older than these other groups. And so from an evolutionary perspective, maybe it probably doesn't matter so much for gardeners, but I just like, it's interesting to me that the 4 groups, small leaf, large leaf, evergreen azalea, deciduous azalea, aren't exactly reflected in the evolutionary history of the group. And then I also like to talk about these groups of plants and how easy they are to grow, because it's very, very, each group is pretty distinct. And so you have plants like your evergreen azaleas, which are pretty easy. I think of them as you can kind of can put them in the ground and then not really have to worry about them again. And then your deciduous azaleas are not that much harder to grow, I think. But then when you get into the rhododendrons, they can really be a struggle. And I kind of think of these elepidote small leaf rhododendrons as being a bit of a challenge. But maybe the most challenging is the large leaf. Depending on the selection, can sometimes be impossible to grow. But I think that's part of the fun of being a gardener. And so in Northeast Ohio, we have this great rhododendron legacy because it was just a really hot plant 100 years ago, 50 years ago. And so we had these local people who just took it upon themselves to try to develop and select really nice, cold hardy rhododendrons, starting with Paul Bosley here, who this is actually him standing in a field of roses at his nursery in Menor, Ohio, which is just north of the Arboretum. And Menor actually used to be the rose capital of the United States. But of course, he didn't grow only roses. And as I mentioned, Charles Dexter was very important in the development of the Holden Arboretum Rhododendron Collection. He was also important in the nursery history of our area too. Paul Bosley would make trips out to Dexter's estate in Massachusetts and collect, and then buy and take Dexter hybrids back to Ohio, and then plant them outside and let the cold winters sort them out. And so every so often you get a really cold winter, and some rhododendrons don't bloom so well, some get some severe damage, and he was able to determine which ones persisted and bloomed really well after those cold winters. And so we have a number of Bosley hybrids, Dexter hybrids that Bosley selected. Bosley didn't do a lot of hybridizing, though he did hybridize Edith Bosley, which is this spectacular purple flowered rhododendron. You have other people, David Leach, who I'll talk about. He's later. He's really important to the Holden story. And his most famous plant is probably Capistrano, which is a zone 5 cold hardy yellow flowered rhododendron. You have people, so this is David Leach here. You have people like Tony Shammarello, who had a nursery just west of the Arboretum. And so he actually even named a rhododendron after the Arboretum. So there's Rhododendron Holden, which you may have seen in garden centers. Fortunately, it's a good one. I don't know what we would do if he had named a bad rhododendron after the Arboretum. But this is Bessie Howells, which is another good Shammarello hybrid. And then Pete Girard, who might be the most significant in the Northeast Ohio rhododendron azalea legacy, because his plants are still pretty commonly sold, especially up here. If you go to a garden center in Northeast Ohio, you can find 5 or 6 different Girard azaleas for sale. And just incredibly, really an improvement on the Gable azaleas, which are also very cold hardy, but just so much more showy. And the Girard hybrids are also quite cold hardy and just good garden plants for our area. And so, of course, we have the David Leach legacy. And so I spend most of my working days during the summer at his legacy research station. David Leach was an eminent horticulturist. He was originally from Western Pennsylvania, and his family owned a glove and clothing factory. And so he was kind of independently wealthy, and just for whatever reason got the rhododendron bug. I don't know how people, choose what plants they just get obsessed with, but David Leach just really got obsessed with rhododendrons. And of course, he lived in Western Pennsylvania, which is incredibly cold, and so he kind of took it upon himself to develop cold hardy, really ornamental rhododendrons. And so he started in Brookville, Pennsylvania in the late 60s. So he had a kind of a disastrous fire at his home, and maybe some personal issues, and decided to pack up shop and move. And he was torn between moving to Western North Carolina and Northeast Ohio. And the story goes that he came to Northeast Ohio. I think he had some connections in the nursery industry here, but just couldn't find what he was looking for and was about to give up. But he decided to hire a plane and fly along the banks of Lake Erie. And so he did that, flew across and saw the piece of property that would become the David G. Leach Research Station, and bought it, and then proceeded to move his whole rhododendron collection from Western Pennsylvania to Northeast Ohio. And I mentioned Tim Brotzman. I think he helped David move some plants from Western Pennsylvania. And so now we have this just breeder's collection of rhododendrons, some named, some not. And what I really think is cool about the collection is that we have plants from the 40s and 50s and the 60s that predated the research station. So we have these ancient rhododendrons in our collection. In the late 1980s, he signed an agreement with Holden Arboretum to continue his research project and rhododendron breeding in perpetuity. And so his research station became part of Holden Arboretum, and we continue that to this day. And so I'll talk a little bit about our rhododendron breeding program. I think we'll start first with the leach plants, because there's just so many of them. So David was supremely interested in cold hardiness because he was from Western Pennsylvania, like it's really cold, and then he moved to Northeast Ohio, which maybe is a little warmer, but not that much warmer. And he wanted to develop superior cold hardy, but with the ornamental diversity of more southern rhododendrons, or less cold hardy rhododendrons. And if you look in the pedigrees of most of his hybrids, you can find essentially one of these plants. I wish I had a picture of Russell Harmon, but so Fabia gets this orange from a species called Rhododendron dicroanthum. And it's a bit of a lax truss. It's kind of flopping over, but it's a color that's really interesting and doesn't exist in cold hardy plants. And he got a lot of his cold hardiness from a white form of Rhododendron catabiense, which is one of our native large leaf elepidote rhododendrons. He used a number of white catabienses, but he most frequently used this Powell glass selection of catabiense, which is just white. And the reason for using white is that the normal form of Catawbians is pink or purple. And so if you have the white and you cross it with another color, it doesn't get washed out by that purple. And then Russell Harmon is a naturally occurring hybrid between our two, the Catawba rhododendron and Rose Bay rhododendron that are native to the eastern United States. And so I think I just want to loop through some of the Leach hybrids. So this is Edmund Amateus, named after his book, not named after his book, named after the illustrator of his book, Rhododendrons of the World, which is quite the tome on rhododendron, and published in 1961, so maybe a little outdated, but still quite a resource for anyone looking to get started on rhododendrons. So that's Edmund Amateus. This is actually another Leach hybrid here called Bosley. Spellbinder, which really looks like a species rhododendron as opposed to a hybrid. And all the hybrids kind of look like mutts when they're not in bloom, but has very large leaves for a cold hardy rhododendron, and the flowers are large, and the buds are quite large too, almost like a racquetball when they've started swelling. Of course, plenty of rhododendrons with complex colors. So, the base color is some kind of pink in these, but you have this nice yellow center, which is really interesting on Rio. And then Blazing Sun, which is maybe a more open growing plant, but I think a more saturated pink with still some of that yellow to the interior. Janet Blair, which is maybe Leach's best, easiest to grow rhododendron hybrid, though there is a bit of a complex story with Janet Blair, because a lot of people in the rhododendron community think that Janet Blair is not a Leach hybrid, because there's another plant floating around called John Wister that looks identical, and John Wister is known to be a Dexter hybrid. And so some people think that somewhere along the way, wires got crossed or something happened, and Leach ended up with a Dexter plant, but claimed it as his own. But we claim it because it's a good plant. VV kind of has a similar look to Janet Blair, just giant trusses with a yellow center, pink exterior. For a while, he was really interested in yak hybrids. So yak, we're referring to a species from Japan, Rhododendron yakushimanum. Well, it has a different name now, but yakushimanum is actually more simple, if you'd believe that. And that refers to this part of southern Japan, just south of Kyushu Island, called Yaku Island, where this rhododendron with this really incredibly fuzzy leaf underside grows. And really, it's just a great foliage plant. But then, of course, when it's in bloom, it's excellent too. This is Crete here, but he has other selections called Mist Maiden, Pink Parasol, all with that really fuzzy leaf, which is just fun to feel, if anything else. Other pinks, oh yes, a number of pinks. This is Vernus, and I had mentioned Tony Shammarello as another local hybridizer. And so actually with Vernus, Tony Shammarello made the cross, and then David grew out the seeds and selected Vernus. Vernus meaning spring. It's a very early bloomer. Actually might be done now for us. We're very close to done. Bravo. I love that he called this Bravo with an exclamation point, like he's really patting himself on the back. But it is quite a spectacular plant, and we have a set of them planted around a black locust tree, and it hasn't bloomed yet. And actually, if you end up making the trip, you might catch it in bloom. Just a really, really nice pink. Other pinks, he has a whole series of late blooming rhododendrons, all beginning with Summer Glow with an enormous truss, kind of a white center to it. Red Sea, which also has it's pink, but it has a nice bicolor with almost like a white star to the center of the flowers. Also late blooming. True Reds, like Singapore, which I would say the truss is a little loose, but I don't think it really matters so much when it's in bloom. And Samoa with these nice translucent stamens to pair with the red flowers. And then another set of reds. These are siblings, Madras and Burma. If you've noticed, David like to name his plants after places. And so I like to think that we're like globe-trotting as we go through the gardens. Madras and Burma have maybe the most spectacular truss of a rhododendron I've ever seen. But the plants themselves are just dogs. They don't know which way is up or down or left or right. But in bloom, it doesn't matter so much. The trusses are just spectacular. And then when you get to these yellows and oranges, I think that's what David was really after, and it took him a while to get. But you have plants like Savannah, which he never released, but he did give it a name with these orange buds that fade to yellow. Borneo, which I think this this photo makes it look more orange than it is, but I would call it orange. Capistrano, which is his kind of crowning achievement, though it's great in a container, and then when you put it in the ground, it tends to not do so well. We like to call it Crapistrano, affectionately, of course. And then because we have this whole collection of leech hybrids, of course, not some of them didn't get names. And so you have ones like this, which is just, I think that it has a cross number. So it's 8330, and then it has a selection number, but no name, just a nice yellow that we get to enjoy. And then he ended up developing these tree type rhododendrons, which is also quite awesome in a cold zone 5. So Holden Spring Herald, which is actually a relatively recent introduction from us in 2010 or 2012. Blooming now, probably close to done, but it's a hybrid between a tree species from China called Rex, so like Tyrannosaurus Rex, and then our native rhododendron catabiense, the Catawba rhododendron. And so you get something kind of in between a full tree and a shrub. Really spectacular. And then Ceylon, which is a Fortunei hybrid, which Fortunei is another tree type species. And you just can't beat this when it's in full bloom. You just have these cascading blooms. And then the king of the castle at the Leach Station, I take people buy this plant all the time, regardless of whether it's in bloom or not. It's just this spectacular, huge rhododendron called Summer Snow. I don't know, maybe 25 feet tall at the Leach Station. And as you might guess, blooms in summer with white flowers, probably the end of June for us. And what I like is you get these white flowers in the tree of a rhododendron, and then they fall to the ground. And so you do really have a summer snow. He did dabble in other rhododendrons, azaleas. Almost all of his deciduous azaleas are hybrids between two of our native species, Cumberlandence and arborescens. And some of them were crosses that he did himself, and some of them were from wild collected seed. But all of these are quite nice. Some of them are fragrant, most of them aren't, but they bloom a little later than your typical early evergreen deciduous azaleas. And he has a whole July series of late blooming deciduous azaleas, all at least 50% rhododendron prunifolium, the plum leaf azalea, a selection called S.D. Coleman, that he named after S.D. Coleman because he got seed from S.D. Coleman for this plant. And this plant normally blooms in August or September for us, but you cross it with other things, it scoots into July. There's 6 of them. They're not all that different from each other. It's like July Jester, Joy, Julep, Jingle, Jubilation. Anyway, Jingle's fragrant, so I like that one the best. And he has a nice pink selection of our native pink shell azalea, Rhododendron vasii, called Spring Spangle. There's other dark pink selections, but this one's ours, so we like it. But when you look at the market, if you go to a grocery store, a garden center, or a nursery, you don't really see leech hybrids for sale, and that's kind of because there's this whole slew of what's called the Ironclads that have dominated the trade. And Ernest Wilson is kind of coined the term Ironclads. He was I'm sure a lot of you know, but he was a plant collector for beach nurseries in England, and then eventually came to the Arnold Arboretum and wrote a list of 14 rhododendrons published in 1917 of the ones that really did well in Boston and survived cold winters in Boston. Plants like Roseum elegans and Catabiense album. Actually very simple hybrids. A lot of them originated in England in like the mid 1800s. And these are kind of the plants that are still on the market today. Nova Zembla, the English Roseum. Nova Zembla was hybridized in like 1902, I think. English Roseum was pre-1850. Just these ancient plants that I think they're just good in production, and they tend to persist pretty well in gardens. And that's just what the nurseries grow. And this is what we're up against as rhododendron breeders. A lot of them are involved with species called Rhododendron ponticum, the pontic rhododendron, which is native to the Iberian Peninsula and the Caucasus. And it's actually an invasive species in the UK, not here, but I think whatever must make ponticum an invasive species in the UK makes it a good parent in our garden hybrids here in the United States. And so this is what we're up against as rhododendron breeders. And so some of the complaints of the leach hybrids are that they're tough to grow and they have a lot of foliar diseases or poor leaf retention. Some people have gone so far as to say that the leach hybrids only grow well at the leach station. Several people have said that to me. And so David died in 1998. His successor was hired in 92 to overlap with him and then continue after David. And so his name is Dr. Steve Krebs. He'd actually just retired, and so I'm now this next person in the line. And he took those complaints to heart and tried to improve the leach hybrids, mostly by two things: adding some disease resistance, and then also trialing rhododendrons at multiple sites. So the more sites you trial a rhododendron, the more you know about how well it's going to perform in different places. And so we usually start our breeding and evaluation process in Madison, Ohio, which is at the Leach Research Station, where the soil is sand. And so it's this perfect environment for rhododendrons because it's well draining. It's like that perfect moist, well-drained soil that they always tell you about in garden books that doesn't really exist for anyone, but it does for us in Madison. And so we start there and make ornamental evaluations. And then we'll take the best of the ornamental plants and trial them in Kirtland, which is at the Arboretum, and it's a gravel loam, so there's a bit more clay in the soil. It's also in a low spot, so it's wetter, and it's in a frost pocket, so it's colder. And so we figure if rhododendrons do well in both of those places, they're probably pretty good. And then we've actually done some trialing. This is all before I got here, but we've done some trialing in Southeast Louisiana too, because we figure if you can grow a rhododendron in Louisiana, it should be able to grow pretty much anywhere. And we've been collaborating with Buddy Lee, who's the inventor of the Encore azaleas, and we've had better results than I really expected. But the disease that we focused on the most is a disease called root rot, which is caused by a fungus-like organism. And if you've grown a rhododendron, you're probably familiar with this, but essentially what happens is it colonizes roots and eventually makes its way up to the crown of the plant. And you'll go from a plant that looks relatively healthy to being permanently wilted and dead. And so if we could develop, and it tends to occur when soil is wet and warm. And so if we can develop, and rhododendrons are quite prone to it. So if we can add some resistance into these hold hardy and ornamental backgrounds of like the leach hybrids, then we're thinking we could have some nice commercial products. And so what we do is we subject our plants to this disease, the pathogen. And so we've been doing field screens recently where we dig out these holes in the ground and put seedling populations and then flood it when it's warm. And that encourages the disease, which we know is in the field, to sporulate, to produce spores and colonize roots on these rhododendrons. And then over time, we see some fallout, and some will die and some will survive. And we tend to say that the ones that died were susceptible, and the ones that survived are resistant, or as resistant as we're going to get. And so where do we get this resistance? There's really a number of sources. Our program, this is all again before me, has really focused on two main sources. There's a cultivar. We don't really know why it's resistant, but it is. It's called Ingrid Melquist. It was just developed by Gustav Melquist of the University of Connecticut. Really a great plant in its own right. Compact, really dark leaves. Flowers and bud are pink but open to white, and the truss is really, really tight. And so that's been a good one for us. So the problem is that it's essentially male sterile because it doesn't produce pollen. So you have to use it as a female parent. And rhododendron hyperythrum, which is a species from Taiwan of all places, actually kind of a marginal plant for us in Northeast Ohio. So in our coldest winters, which we're technically zone 6B as of the last update, but which means that it's supposed to get -5 at the coldest, but then in 2015 it got to -24. So in a winter like that, this will get killed to the snow line. But otherwise, a pretty tough plant with just natural resistance to the disease. It's also a pretty plant, and a nice pretty plant in its own right. Buds are pink. Eventually, it'll be completely completely white. I would say the truss is a little lax. The flowers kind of flop over themselves. So I don't know how much it matters when you have something like this. The petals are also kind of thin, and so they don't hold up so well in tough weather or in the sun. But the leaves are really dark green and they curve. And really, this would probably be a good plant in the DC area on its own. But it's also good because the resistance that it has can be passed on to the offspring. So this is work that Steve Krebs did, where he took Rhododendron hyperythrum, the species from Taiwan, here, which in this solid line, and then Rhododendron capistrano open pollinated seedlings. Capistrano is known susceptible to the disease here, and then a cross with seedlings from the two between capistrano and hyperythrum here, and then subjected them to the pathogen, the disease, and so over time, we got about 25% mortality with Rhododendron hyperythrum, and you get essentially 100% mortality with the capistrano open pollinated seedlings. But in the first generation hybrids, you get about 50% mortality. So we call maybe 50% of them resistant to root rot. And so that's been a key plant in our breeding program. And here are some of the first generation hybrids. There are some problems with the hybrids, mostly. So rhododendron has this, hyperythrum has really three drawbacks for us. One is that the flower buds are pink and they fade to white. And so it turns out that a lot of the offspring also have pink fading to white flowers. They still also tend to be really thin and not hold, the flower petals tend to be really thin and not hold up very well. And then also they didn't really get the full, we really aim for zone 5 cold hardiness, and most of them just don't have it. And so we're moving on. We're in the first back cross generation. So we took these hyperythrum hybrids and crossed them back to plants like the Leach hybrids to recover cold hardiness and ornamental features, while also hoping we maintain that resistance. It's also quite tolerant to sun and heat. And so we have a new introduction, well, relatively new introduction. This is called Splendor, Southgate Splendor. It's part of the Southern Living Plant Collection. They have a whole line of rhododendrons. Most of them are actually from a breeder in Louisiana, but this is ours. We think it's the most ornamental one, and it's called Splendor. And if you can find, I don't know how far the Southern Living Plant Collection goes, but I would encourage you to look for this in your garden center, because if you're going to be able to grow a rhododendron in DC, it's probably one of these Southgate type hybrids. So that's kind of where we are with our breeding program right now. I want to talk about some other rhododendrons that we have in our area. So of course we have evergreen azaleas, and we have to have cold hardy evergreen azaleas, and cold hardy evergreen azaleas essentially get their cold hardiness from two species. There's Rhododendron camphori, which is the torch azalea, and Rhododendron yedoense, which is the Korean azalea. And so if you look at the background of a garden azalea in our area, they almost certainly have one of these plants in their background, maybe both. And so some of the earliest hybrids were by Joe Gable, who was from central Pennsylvania, and I mean, you can clearly see the camphori torch azalea in here with that same color. And so these are all quite cold hardy, maybe even more cold hardy than the Girard hybrids, but I would say the Girard hybrids are more refined ornamentally. But yeah, so you have Stortstonian, Rosebud, Karen's is another one that's pretty good for us. Oddly enough, there is another species from Taiwan that's ended up in hybrids that are good for us in our area. The North Tisbury hybrids are from Polly Hill in Martha's Vineyard, and she has a lot of hybrids using a species called Rhododendron nakahari. She has a selection called Mount Seven Star, but they're crosses just using that species, and it's incredibly, it's like, I have one in a pot, and it's like this tall, and it's just perfectly content being this tall, and they end up being ground covers for us. And a lot of them bloom a month later than your normal evergreen azaleas, but a lot of these are pretty good for us. Yeah, Marilee, Alexander, Michael Hill, Susanna Hill. I think she named a lot of them. It's like the whole Hill family got a name. Tony Shammarello, who is a local hybridizer who mostly worked on rhododendrons, but also worked on evergreen azaleas and has a number of ones that have persisted in commerce here, and you can find these at garden centers. Elsie Lee, Hino Red, Hino White. I think there's a Hino Pink too. Red, which is actually blooming right now, and I don't know how else to describe it except for it's a red. It's just really, it's a red, but it's extra red. At Helen Curtis. All of these are really good for us. And then the Girard hybrids, which I think are really the standard for ornamental azaleas. And there's many of them, but I want to talk about two in particular because these are kind of hard to find in commerce, but we have them. The one is called Unsurpassable, and it's like, when I saw this plant, I saw it not in bloom, and I was just like, so he named this plant Unsurpassable. Like, how? It's got to be like a pretty spectacular azalea, but then it bloomed, and I was like, okay, that seems about right. It just covers itself in these, neon, just this like very vibrant pinkish flowers. And then Caitlin. So actually, the Girard hybrids come from Pete Girard Jr., Senior, and Junior, and Caitlin was Pete Girard Jr.'s last azalea selection, and it's this actually introduced in 2006. But these nice apple blossom, pink and white flowers on a pretty nice plant. Though I can't seem to root it. It's like evergreen azaleas are pretty easy to propagate for whatever reason. I just can't get Girard's Caitlin to root very well. And then there's another species that has actually turned out to be pretty good for us, Rhododendron cayusianum. So that's cayusianum referring to Kyushu Island of Japan. And they're these really squat mounding azaleas. I think a lot of these are probably not straight cayusianum, they're probably hybrids, but just these really compact plants that cover themselves in bloom. And there's one in particular here that I like called Daisen Haku, which I can't find anywhere except in our garden, that has mostly white flowers, but every so often they'll be purple. And I think that's really cool. Of course, lots of deciduous azaleas are good for us too. What we're running into is probably for a while, but especially now is a lot of these early hybrids tend to get a lot of powdery mildew and rust. So Arneson Gem, the Girard deciduous azaleas, which are several of them. There's Mount St. Helen is one. And the Northern Lights, which are developed in Minnesota. So maybe they should just stay in Minnesota. But overall, not so bad for us. But it's by the end of the season, they just look pretty ragged. They get pretty good amount of powdery mildew and rust throughout the season. But one that we've actually found out is actually a pretty good doer for us is Rhododendron Austrinum, the Florida flame azalea. So we had maybe one of the coldest winters ever here. Where it got to -24 at the Leach station, -28 at the Arboretum in 2015. And Rhododendron Austrinum sailed through it. We had flowers. It was just incredibly floriferous. And so we're thinking this is probably a good one. And we're kind of experimenting with some of these hybrids with Austrinum now that we have this indication that it might be a pretty good plant for us. Really, the standard deciduous azaleas in our area are the Weston hybrids. So Weston Nurseries is in Massachusetts, and they're just incredibly prolific hybridizers like Dexter, and have really a lasting impact. PJM comes from them. And so they have these late blooming ones using our native viscosum, the swamp, I guess you call it the swamp azalea, as one of the parents. And just all really nice and pretty mildew resistant too. Millennium with these blue leaves, lemon drop with yellow flowers. And I'll throw the Leach hybrid July Jingle in for these late bloomers that are also pretty good, though you'll struggle to find some of these Leach hybrids for sale. And Rhododendron prunifolium, the plum leaf azalea, is quite spectacular in its own right. And as I mentioned earlier, for us blooms in August and September, which is pretty awesome when not much else is blooming. Yaku Prince is one that I see for sale every so often. It's a Shammarello hybrid that has these floating clouds of pink. It's a yak hybrid using that species from very, very southern Japan. It's just a nice compact plant. Of course, when it's 30 or 40 years old, it gets a little tall, but really nice. Olga Mezid is another Weston hybrid that just persists in our garden. A similar pedigree to the PJM hybrids, but a little different. And you see that in these like purple, it's like a purple pink flower as opposed to purple. And then some other some other plants that I just like in our garden. This is done blooming for a while, but this is a lepidote, meaning it has the scales on its leaves and small leaf. But usually they're pretty small, but angel powder is big. It just, I don't know, it didn't get the message. And it has big flowers for a lepidote too. Linda Jean, which is a hybrid from a breeder in Pittsburgh, which has these, yeah, I mean, I would call this orange too, and the buds are kind of red. That's another good doer for us. And then cowsap with this immaculate truss with white, but then a really incredibly dark blotch. Really nice one. And then a yellow that I'm particularly fond of is one called Vinecrest, which is selected in the Niagara region, but has these like fire truck red buds that eventually fade to yellow, and then you have a plant that's just covered in yellow flowers. And I think it's a better plant than Leach's Capistrano. And so we have all these awesome rhododendrons, and there's really too many, but you know, what is new in rhododendron? And I would say really not a lot. You have the Encores, which have been around since the late 90s. And the Encores, I presume they're sold in garden centers in your area. We don't get them. I don't know if there's an Encore that is really hardy for us. We have some in our gardens that persist, but I wouldn't call them hardy. But these are these ones that rebloom, so they'll have a nice spring bloom, and then you'll get sporadic blooming in the fall, and a strong sporadic blooms in the summer, and then a nice fall bloom. And of course, every nursery company has their own version of the Encore. So Proven Winners has their own, anyway, there's lots to pick from. And so that's exciting. And Proven Winners does have their own line of rhododendrons. And actually, you might be able to find these in garden centers by you. I would say probably stay away from purple, because that was selected in New Hampshire. So I don't even know if I'd try it here in Ohio. It could be fine. But pink and color wheel are both first generation hyperythrum hybrids. Color wheel, and is a pretty nice truss, and I'd say a pretty good plant. Pink is fine. It's pink. But as, in terms of adaptability, I'd say if you can find these, give it a shot. They're nice enough plants, and it's a rhododendron that can probably take some heat and the adverse garden conditions for NDC for a rhododendron. And then there is the whole Southgate line. So this was, as I mentioned, developed by a breeder in Louisiana, and the breeder his name is John Thornton, and of all professions, he was a veterinarian, not a rhododendron breeder, but did breed rhododendrons in his spare time. And so there's a whole series of them that we were lucky to get our Splendor included with. These are also these first generation rhododendron hyperythrum hybrids that I would say in most cases are kind of inferior, like the Proven Winner plants, kind of inferior ornamentally, but superior in terms of adaptability. And so if you want to try a rhododendron that's not a plain old ironclad, I'd say give one of these a shot. We do have a number of rhododendrons. So Holden Spring Herald, if you can find it, is a relatively recent release. Holden Solar Flare with this really an enormous truss of yellow. It's like a light yellow, but with a deep blotch. Flare is spelled with an A-I and not an A-R-E. That wasn't my decision, but I think it's kind of funny. And of course, our Splendor. And then, breeding woody plants is a long haul, and you don't really know when you're going to get to introduce something. But we do have some stuff in the works. We actually just filed a patent on a rhododendron. We have really, for whatever reasons, sometimes you make a cross and there's all kinds of good stuff that comes out of it. And so we crossed Ingrid Malquist by Rio in 2000. And this plant, we just filed a patent for, and the release process is going to be slow, but I would say in the next 5 years, you'd probably be able to find this in garden centers. I don't know how far south it's going to go. It's not a hyperythrum hybrid, so I don't know how comfortable I would be selling it further south, but I think people should try it because it is root rot resistant. It takes full sun in Northeast Ohio. So it's not your typical rhododendron. This is a full sibling that's also kind of far along in the process. And then we have a whole set of other ones that I just got to go ahead to collect the patent data. So I think we'll have a whole series that is coming out in the near-ish future. It's just, woody plants are a bit of a slog. And so with that, I want to talk about one last thing that we're pretty excited about with rhododendrons, and that's grafting. Because if you look at the cultivar registry, which is this whole list of all the rhododendrons known to man, there's like 25,000 or 30,000 rhododendrons created and named. And so all of the work has been done ornamentally. There's so many pretty rhododendrons. You really don't need to do anything to improve them in that regard. Where they need improvements is in adaptability, because they're just hard to grow, even in the places where they're supposed to be easy to grow. And so we're kind of interested in this idea of grafting rhododendrons. They do it with plenty of other crops, where you graft an apple onto a more adapted rootstock, or you graft grapes onto a more adapted rootstock. So why couldn't you do it with a rhododendron? And for a while, people grafted rhododendrons, especially in Europe, mostly for ease of propagation. Some of these are pretty hard to root by cuttings. And so if you graft it, it's relatively easy. And Rhododendron ponticum, that invasive species from the UK, the ponic rhododendron, was kind of the classic rootstock, but it turned out to be too vigorous and would sucker all the time. And you'd eventually lose your plant that was grafted onto ponticum, because it would just send up these purple flowered suckers. People eventually shifted to Cunningham's white, which is, I think, was created in like 1830. So it's another one of these ancient rhododendrons, but it's kind of an industry standard for rootstocks. And actually people sell it here as just a regular old garden plant, not a rootstock. Then recently, well, I say recently, it's probably 20, 25 years old now. But there's this whole line of supposedly lime tolerant rootstocks. Rhododendrons are notorious for needing acid soils. And so there's this whole line called Incarho that's supposed to be, well, they don't say lime, they say like neutral. So up to pH of like 7 or 7.5, I think, tolerant. We have some data that says maybe that's not true, but it is incredibly vigorous, and it appears to be root rot resistant too. And so Incarho could be this nice rootstock for grafting otherwise really ornamental plants onto a better adapted rootstock. And actually it's off patent a year from this coming October, so it's free to use. But then we're wondering, well, what else is out there? We have all these hyperythrum hybrids. We have hyperythrum itself. Maybe these would be good. There's another plant, it's an ironclad called English Roseum, and folks from Ohio State University in the 70s screened it for resistance to root rot, and it came out, well, actually there's been varying reports of it being susceptible and resistant. But there's this one strain they're calling called Grutendorst. You know, when you have a plant was selected in the 1850s, it's pretty understandable that over time, you might have some sports that show up, or someone gets a mix up along the way, and English Roseum could exist under multiple different plants could exist under that one name. But we have one that we screened ourselves for resistance to root rot, and it seems like it is resistant. And so we've been doing grafting onto English Roseum as well. And grafting with rhododendrons is kind of fun because we do this technique. In other crops, they call it stenting sometimes, or in rhododendrons, they call it cutting grafting, where you root a cutting and you graft at the same time. So this is the scion, or the top part of the plant. This is your rootstock. You know, essentially both of them are what would look like a stem cutting. And you essentially just wound this side, the one side of your rootstock, wound one side of your scion, tie them together, and then put them under mist for three months or so. What will happen is that the scion and rootstock will knit together, and you'll grow roots on your rootstock. And so you do it all in one step instead of having to, root a cutting and then graft later. And we see a real vigor effect from rootstock. So this is, for example, if you Holden, which is a Shammarello hybrid, on its own roots compared to Holden grafted onto the Incarho rootstock. And so you get a vigor effect alone. And these are, this is this Holden plant outside of a rhododendron discovery garden, which is, if you come visit, it's a debacle, and it's actually kind of discouraging. But we've had some issues with our rhododendron discovery garden, but this is right outside the discovery garden and thriving in full sun. And then we also see things like improved adaptability in addition to the vigor. So Capistrano, affectionately called Crapistrano, we planted pairs of them, about 6 pairs, on its own roots or grafted. And essentially in every single pair, the own rooted plant died, and the grafted one on Incarho is alive and thriving, except for some of them got crushed by the snow recently. But we really think that there's an adaptability aspect to grafting that could be beneficial. And then I mentioned those English Roseum grafts, which you could have adaptability from an ironclad plus maybe some root rot resistance. And these things, I mean, they're less than a year old from cuttings and grafts and or from grafting, and they've essentially filled a 2-gallon container. And so there's a whole vigor component to maybe a leach hybrid that might be slow growing and not so easy to grow. But we're kind of excited about grafting. I don't know how receptive the nursery industry would be to it, just because it's kind of involved for this group of plants. But we think it's good for our rhododendron collection at Holden, and we're going to be selling grafted plants at our plant sales. And if you come visit, I can show you some grafted plants. And so with that, I'll conclude my talk. Take any questions. You're welcome to email me whenever. This is my email. I also post lots of photos from our rhododendron gardens on my Instagram, so you're welcome to follow me there. But thanks for having me.
Connor, this has been so wonderful. I really appreciate your enthusiasm. I have learned a ton. There are 3 questions in the chat, and I don't know if you can see that or if you want me to read them to you.
Yeah, I see them.
Okay.
So I got Eric's question about increasing heat resistance in rhododendrons. Yeah, so I probably should have touched on it a little more, but so that species Rhododendron hyperythrum, I don't know if I'd say it thrives, but in the right site, it can do incredibly well in southern Louisiana. And I mean, besides going into like Texas or I don't know, the Southwest or southern Florida, that's about as hot as it gets in the United States. And so indirectly, you know, we're trying really to breed for Northeast Ohio, and then hopefully that'll radiate out. But using that species has really opened, I think, the doors for people who want to grow rhododendrons in a hotter area. And what we're seeing is we have the first generation of hyperythrum hybrids, I said was not fully cold hardy, and so we went to the next generation. So these plants are 25% rhododendron hyperythrum, and those plants are still doing well in Louisiana. And so we're hoping to have like these really ornamental ones that are good from, let's say, zones 5 to 9. There's a question about Exbury azaleas. Yeah, I think the Exbury azaleas are fine. As I mentioned, it's really just so the Exbury azaleas use a species of azalea. Well, a lot of them use one called luteum, which has these incredibly fragrant yellow flowers. Ours is just hitting full bloom now, but it's the whole powdery mildew thing. So it's they're nice enough plants, but then once they're out of bloom, they look kind of ragged. Yeah, I saw some comment about loving PJMs. Yeah, they're nice. I like to call them, well, PJM means, I think, Peter J. Mezit. I like to call them Purple J meatballs because that's what they always look like. Let's see, what else we got? Yeah, so there's a question about the deer. And so at the leach station, fortunately, before I got here, they put up a deer fence around the whole property. And so we just get to look at the deer walking the length of the fence from the outside, and we don't really have to deal with them eating our plants. And then same thing at the arboretum. They have the core of the arboretum is kind of fenced in, or maybe there's just enough foot traffic to keep them away. Yeah, let's see. How do you manage disease, sanitize an area after trialing a weak plant? Are there, yeah. So there are rhododendron diseases that persist in the soil, and that's a problem with rhododendron cultivation, because essentially what you're going to have, if you're not planting a plant that's resistant to soil diseases, and you have a rhododendron that dies in that spot, then you're just going to be taking, and then you plant another rhododendron in that spot. You still have that same disease in that area. So really, the best thing to do is not put a rhododendron in a spot where a rhododendron died. Because the root rot disease has these resting spores that can persist for years, and so there are ways to. I mean, you can solarize your soil if you're pretty sure that your plant died from root rot. You can solarize it, so you put hot plastic over your soil, maybe put some water, underneath and just let the sun kind of bake the soil and kill anything. But aside from that, just don't plant a rhododendron in a spot where you've had other plants die. So if a plant starts dying from Phytophthora, I think you're kind of SOL. So we're out of luck. It's a real problem. And so another thing is that there's lots of different types of Phytophthora. So there's a soil Phytophthora, Phytophthora cinnamomi. There's other ones too. Actually, there's another one that seems to be becoming more common. But there's also aerial Phytophthora. So there's one that causes stem dieback. And so sometimes you'll just see dead stems on a rhododendron, and that you can handle. So what you would do is take a dead stem and cut it off. But then when you look at the cross section of where you cut the stem off, see if it's clean or if there's like a dark patch inside the stem. And if there's still a dark patch, you need to keep going, cutting further back until there's no dark patch anymore, because otherwise you're still going to have that disease in the plant.
These are great questions. Does anybody have any more? Connor, I really want to thank you. This has been fantastic. I have learned more than I ever thought there was about rhododendrons. It's not something I came to this talk knowing much about at all. And this has been fantastic. And I appreciate you generating such enthusiasm. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And of course, I think we had talked about maybe people coming out the weekend of the 23rd or the 24th, and you're more than welcome to. It's funny, the research station is closed to the public actually 99% of the time. And so anytime someone wants to come visit, I'm always just like jumping to let people come and see, because it really is such a special place.
I know Jim is behind on planning and he had to jump off or something, but Jim wants to come and bring a group. And he's trying to decide between a Saturday, Sunday, and a Monday, Tuesday. I can't remember the dates, Connor, but I know we were in communication about it. And so I may be the only person who still works, but most of the people who do not work, then I'm not sure it matters, but he's trying to figure the details out.
Yeah, that's totally fine. And if it doesn't work out this year, you're welcome anytime.
Well, I know everybody wants to do it, so it's just a question of getting it scheduled. But this has been a great talk. We have recorded it. I will ask our web person to post it to the site for the Four Seasons Garden Club, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Okay, and we have a YouTube, what's it called? A YouTube channel?
Yeah, channel. Yeah.
Thanks. And the YouTube, and if you don't mind, we'd like to post it there too, because it's easier for some people to listen to it there rather than from the website.
Sure, that's totally fine.
Okay, all right. Only with your permission, but I'll send you.
Yeah, it's funny. I've given a similar version of this talk a few times, and I think it's probably posted in like different parts of YouTube. So you can probably like watch me see like how this talk has evolved over the spring.
I can say we have had the latest version, so I know it's the best.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We'll be in touch when to have an in-person visit.
That sounds great. Thanks for having me.
All right, bye-bye.